Welcome back, students, to the second episode of our Great Transformation, a heuristic concept. We are now focusing on the drivers of the low-carbon transformation and on the processes which are pushing forward the low-carbon transformation. The learning outcomes are summarized here. We will have a better understanding of, after this discussion, about what we mean by managing a low-carbon transformation. We will differentiate different actors which are important. We will talk about different terms and concepts like what a niche, an innovation niche is about, what co-evolution is about. And at the end I will finish with some policy instruments which I will not go into in detail because we do have a specific lecture on the instruments also. So the major point now is about our concept of how the transformation actually works. And I'm starting with this diagram, which is absolutely central for our thinking. And we borrowed the major concept of this diagram from our colleagues from the Netherlands, from Grin et al. And what you can see here is something like a sinus curve. And we do have the following things in mind. Our first point here is that the transformation, the low-carbon transformation, did not start yesterday morning. It already started years ago. Have in mind the Limits to Growth study in the 70s. Have in mind the Rio conference in 1992, a huge debate already on sustainability. So there is a history of the low-carbon transformation. What you can see then, having in front of you this curve, is that from the high carbon regime to the low carbon regime, this is not a linear learning process. It's not a linear transformation. It is the need to climb up this ladder from the high carbon regime to the low carbon policy regime. So we need a process of acceleration of efforts. We need specific transformational policies to make this transformation happen. What we are currently on is probably a path which is characterized by this yellow line here. This is the business as usual trajectory. This is a process in which we organize some green transformations, some low carbon transformations, but those might be overcompensated by growth. And we run into rebound effects. So this is a path, a trajectory which will end then in a 3 to 5 degrees Celsius plus world in the future. What we need to do is to organize the green trajectory here, and the question which I would like to discuss with you during the next 20 minutes is which areas of drivers, which arenas of change are relevant and important to climb up this green ladder here. Because what we need to achieve is to scale up low-carbon pilots to low-carbon systems, to setting the course long-term with roadmaps towards 2050. We need to come from sector reforms to system reforms. We spoke already about cities. Cities is the combination of infrastructure, transportation, how people work, how people consume, buildings. So system reforms are very important. And how are we going to organize that? Which arenas of change are relevant? This is what I would like to demonstrate. In order to do that, I would like to differentiate or to compare the current situation with the situation in the global economy in 1992. In 1992, during the first Rio conference on global development and environment. And this is the next slide here. So this is the Rio conference in 1992. It is a bit abstract, but I will explain to you what we do have in mind. What we do have in mind is that if you look at the middle here, you can see the high carbon regime. The high carbon economy is not a sector. It's not only about the energy sector. It's not only about coal. The high carbon economy is a system which is based on high carbon science developments, which is based on culture, which is based on policies pushing forward high carbon growth patterns. It's about high carbon technologies. It's about markets and preferences and power structures in the high carbon economy. So it is a system. And what you can see here that in 1992, when the Rio conference #1 took place, this high carbon regime was very, very stable. And what you see on the bottom part of the diagram, on the left-hand side, this is what we call, based on concepts and theories also pushed forward by our colleagues from the Netherlands, Grin et al., You can see what we call niche levels and niche dimensions. What we do have in mind here is that there is a high carbon regime, but on the bottom you see low carbon experiments, low carbon actors, which already start to think towards low carbon concepts and policies, or business people already going into resource efficiency and renewable energy sectors in a situation in which the high carbon regime as such is still very, very stable. So niches and change agents are very important. How was the situation in 1992? In 1992, 155 presidents of state declared and signed a document, the Agenda 21, focusing on the damages of the high carbon regime and of resource-based growth models, arguing that what we need is a sustainable economy which needs to be low carbon and which needs to be very high resource efficient. Sustainability. The concept has been brought up by the Brundtland report, which has been published in 1987 already. So the situation was the high carbon regime was very stable. But presidents of state argued that this business as usual growth pattern is not any longer capable to manage the interactions between the environment and the economies. I would argue, and we argue in our flagship report, that in this situation, the arguments of the Agenda 21, which has been signed in Rio 1992, was a minority position. In our societies, in the economy, there was not even one government on earth really going low carbon. Not even one important sector in our economies really radically going low carbon or resource efficiency. So sustainability, low carbon, was still a minority discourse in our societies, in the economy, in the political system. Interestingly, signed by political presidents and heads of governments around the world, which stated that we do have a problem, but still moving forward in the old system. This was the situation in 1992. And we try to demonstrate in our flagship report that the situation now is different and that we do have on different levels, we call them arenas of change, already strong dynamics towards low carbon, towards the low carbon transformation which we need and which we argue for. So the situation in which we were in 1992 was that heads of presidents and heads of governments argued that the business as usual growth pattern has no future. But the new system, the new model, the new concept was still not existing or very, very weak. I talked about these minority discourses or minority business investments in several sectors in our economies. But business as usual was still dominating real politics and real economics. To see a transformation emerging, the new model, the low carbon model, needs to emerge. It needs to gain importance. It needs to grow. It needs to grow faster in terms of investments and in terms of the growth of sectors than the old high carbon setting. It needs to get dominant. And we argue that there are many processes now which are going into this transformation direction. And this is what I wanted to show you with the next slide. So this is the slide where we again see the green curve, the transformation process as such. And we see in the middle of the curve, on the left and on the right-hand side, the different arenas of change which we are going to discuss. Before we do that, I would like to go briefly to the beginning of the curve here on the left-hand side and to the end of the curve here on the right-hand side. And what we do have here is the cognitive map of our political and economic decision makers. What we bring out in our flagship report, and now we are on the left-hand side, on the bottom of the curve, is that the legitimacy of the business as usual growth pattern has been eroding after 1992, after the Rio conference. You find relatively few people in the business centers around the world, or when you talk to political decision makers, which still believe that the business as usual growth pattern, high carbon, resource intensive, will be sustainable for the next decades to come towards mid of the century. People know and this implies legitimacy of business as usual is eroding, people know that this kind of growth is not affordable for a world with 9 billion people in 2050 within the planetary boundaries. This is common knowledge today. So on the one hand side, legitimacy of the business as usual growth process is eroding. On the other hand side, and now I'm on the right hand side of the curve, on the top here, we know much better now how a low carbon society, how a low carbon economy, how low carbon policies actually need to look like. Our knowledge is better. Our cognitive framework is much better. In 1992, we did not have a concept to make this sustainability transformation happen. Now we do have this kind of concepts. We do have a lot of material. Many institutions from the World Bank to the OECD, many universities working on low carbon transformation processes. We now do have the knowledge to make the transformation happen. There is a vision. Remember the drivers of transformation. Without a vision, you can't make the transformation. Now we are able to do that, much better informed than 20 years ago when the Rio conference in 1992 took place. So let's then go into the curve, and let's then go into these different arenas of change, which we perceive as the most important arenas and dimensions where the transformation needs to take place, and from our perspective in many societies is already taking place. The argument will be that we are now in a situation in which the major ingredients, the major elements of the transformation are there. It's not sure, of course, that the transformation will take place, but the elements to make the transformation are there. And those elements haven't been existing only 2 decades ago. So let's go into the 5 dimensions which we are discussing in our flagship report. The first one is the growing number of actors of change. So actors of change which are driving towards the low carbon transformation. This is about companies. In Germany, between 15 to 25% of our economy are oriented on resource efficiency, on low carbon technologies, on resource technologies. So important parts of our business people are now thinking into a low carbon and sustainability direction. When you look into business companies, or when you looked into business companies only 20 years ago, you saw corporate social responsibility departments, 2 or 3 people talking about social and environmental dimensions of doing business. So this was not part of the investment business, it was window dressing and communication towards the public. If you go into the big European companies today, very often you see that the most important investments in new sectors, new activities, new products are going into green, low carbon and resource efficiency investments. Many people perceive these kind of investments as highly important because here are the most important employment opportunities and innovation opportunities in the global economy. But it's not only businesses which are growing in number in terms of going low carbon for resource efficiency and for green investments. It's also about governments. I said that in 1992 there was not even one government in the international system which really went for sustainability-oriented development strategies. Now we do have a bigger and growing group of governments which are on the ground, nationally and locally, going for low-carbon investments. Germany is one example. We do have an energy transformation plan in Germany which aims at reducing the greenhouse gas emissions in our country by 80 to 95% towards 2050. And we do have similar plans in the UK also. But you can see similar dynamics in China and emerging economies. India is starting now to go into a similar direction. What I would like to say here, and what we are trying to demonstrate in our flagship report, is that power shifts are taking place. Low carbon activities are gaining power in our societies and in our economies. Let's go to the right-hand side of the curve, the green innovations. I already said and argued that we are optimistic from a technological perspective. The investments in low-carbon technologies are high, and we can argue that in the important transformational sectors, urban sectors energy sectors, land use sectors. We do have the technologies needed to make the transformation happen. And this is completely different from only 20 years ago. Let's go to the left-hand side again, shifting norms and values and heuristics. We do have debates now on green growth. We do have debates now on what quality of life is about. We do have debates on sustainability-oriented investment funds, on sustainability-oriented investments in our economies. This has been minority discourses, as I argued, only 20 years ago in Rio. Now this is part of our political setting in many societies around the world. And we bring together the information about these discourses, about shifting norms and values in our societies, in our flagship report. Now look at the policy regimes. I already argued that during the Rio conference 1992, 20 years ago, these policy regimes around the world have been very, very stable, oriented towards high carbon regimes, high carbon policies, and unsustainable resource use. And what we can see today, during the last years of after Rio +20, many changes has been taking place. We do have feed-in tariffs in many countries now. We do have efficiency goals for energy systems and energy sectors in many countries around the world now. We do have ecological taxes. So what we try to demonstrate is that in many countries there are already transformational policy regimes emerging. We do not argue that this is already sufficient, but we argue that there is a transformation path which is already gaining importance and accelerating. Then we do have the last dimension of change, the last arena of change here on the right-hand side, the international context. And this is actually the dimension where we are less optimistic. You saw and listened to my arguments regarding the other arenas of change, where we are arguing that many processes are going into the right direction. In the international arenas, we are not making progress. The negotiations around climate change are an important example for that. But we focus in our study on two important points. The first important point is that there are two big actors which are going low carbon. And these two big actors are the European Union on the one hand side and China on the other hand side. There is healthy competition between both, but also cooperation between both. That China is going now towards low carbon, high investments in low carbon sectors, high investments in renewable energies, transforming its incentive scheme towards resource efficiency. This kind of reforms in China are helping us to make low carbon investments also. Because many business people are arguing that if we go alone, we will lose our competitiveness. But if China and Europe, if we both go into the same direction, we can really trigger the global economy towards a new development path. So it's about China, it's about Europe, and about their new strategies towards low carbon investments. The second element which we bring to the forefront is that we see that currently multilateral agreements together with 192 states are very difficult to manage. Therefore, we argue for what we call pioneering alliances of low-carbon actors. We asked the German government and we asked the European community and the European Union to build a low-carbon alliance of 6, 7, 10 important other nations and economic actors which are moving into the same direction. The main idea is that if Germany and Europe and let's say Brazil and India or even China would go into the same direction, we would be able to organize a tipping point in the global economy towards low carbon. So international context is about China and Europe, and it is about building these kind of pioneer groups which are going low carbon together. And what we do have in mind here are joint investments in low carbon training of engineers for low carbon sectors. What we do have in mind is building up university faculties for low carbon architects, which are going to manage the urbanization shift during the next 4 decades. and in doing these kind of investments in a group of countries together to signal to the rest of the world that these countries are going into the new direction. So making this kind of acceleration happen might be based on better cooperation in the international context, and we are optimistic that this is possible. So I'm coming to two last slides now. The first thing which I wanted to add here is based on this slide, which is showing again the sinus curve, the green curve, the transformation process from the high carbon regime to the low carbon regime. And we focus on three mechanisms which are pushing forward the green transformation and the low carbon transformation. And this is what I would like to focus on now. Our first argument is that we have been seeing these arenas of change. We saw new narratives. The low carbon narrative is stronger now. The sustainable narrative is stronger now. We saw that many more actors are going low carbon now than 20 years ago. We saw that innovation processes are accelerating towards low carbon and sustainability. We saw policy regimes and the international context going into this direction as norms and values. And our argument is that there is a co-evolutionary process in which these different arenas are mutually reinforcing themselves. So more actors going green implies that investments in other sectors are gaining importance also. Shifting norms and values in our societies towards low carbon, towards the understanding that we need to accept the planetary boundaries, implies that policy regime reforms are much easier than before. So co-evolution. Things are interacting and moving into the same direction, into a low carbon direction. So this is something which we cannot steer. This is something which we cannot govern. This is something which governments cannot organize. These are societal processes based on co-evolution. There is a second important driver which brings these different kinds of dynamics together, which we have been discussing. And these are transformational policies. I will coming back to the transformational policies in a second. So policy can do things to improve the situation and to accelerate the transformational processes which are already emerging and gaining importance. The last element here, the last mechanism is what we do have as a title of our flagship report, the Social Contract for Sustainable Development. So we borrowed the concept of a social contract from important thinkers like John Locke or Immanuel Kant or Rousseau. And those thinkers argued that in a situation in which societies are looking towards a new direction, are reorganizing their social pillars and the basic structures of their societies, they need a social contract to make these transformation processes legitimate. What these thinkers had in mind was the process towards democracy. They argued that without a social contract on democracy, democracy will not be stable. And they argued therefore in favor of building these kind of social contracts in different societies. There are other examples for social contracts to stabilize new social situations. Have in mind the abolition of slavery. Have in mind the abolition of child labor. Have in mind, I gave a presentation several weeks ago in South Africa, a social contract for the abolition of apartheid. So organizing a situation in which people have in mind that business as usual, the old way to organize things, in our case the high carbon economy, are not any longer socially acceptable. So in a situation in which people would argue that high carbon development is not only a problem, we should do something, but a situation in which they would argue high carbon development is socially not acceptable because we are undermining the future options for coming generations. It is as unacceptable as child labor is, or as unacceptable as slavery was. In such a situation, the transformation would obviously accelerate. So organizing a social contract is our third mechanism. Co-evolution, social contract, and transformational policies. My last slide is on these transformational policies. And I will not go into the details because we do have a specific lecture on the transformational policies. What you can see here is that we organized 10 bundles of instruments to make the low-carbon transformation happen. And I will finish only with our central idea here is that there are two different strategies to make the transformation happen, to accelerate the transformation. One strategy might be what we call a focused strategy. So if we would be able to organize a global emission trading scheme worldwide, this would have a huge leverage. But probably we are not going to see this kind of global emission trading scheme during the next 2, 3, 4 years to come. So this is the first strategy, big leverage. Where you are not able to organize these big leverages in a sector, in a national economy, on the global level, you have to go for polycentric strategies. For many instruments, for many leverages, but moving and shifting and triggering into the right direction. And this is what we are this is what we are presenting in our chapter on the instruments needed for the low-carbon transformation. And this is what we are going to see in detail in the lecture or during the lecture about the instruments for the low-carbon transformation. So this has been the lecture, or the two lectures, the two episodes on the concept which we developed for the great transformation towards the low-carbon economy. We have been seeing already several exercises for self-study for the first episode. We do have here also some examples for self-study for the second episode. We have been talking about low carbon and high carbon not as sectors, but as a regime, as a system. So we would like to ask you to reflect on that. How to transform a high carbon system into a low carbon system and where to start. And have in mind that we discussed what kind of role policy action can play and where the barriers for policy actions and the limits for policy actions also are. We have been discussing the need for social contracts, which no government can organize or implement. So there are options for policy action, but also limits for policy actions. And then the concept of the social contract itself. So what can we learn from the idea of a social contract which has been developed 200, 250, 300 years ago when our societies developed and implemented and invented before democracies? What can we learn from this kind of social contracts for the transformation towards low-carbon societies around the world? And how can social contracts on the global scale be built? So these are some of the questions which I would like to challenge you to reflect about. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you very much for being patient. And I hope it was a lecture which helped you to understand what great transformations towards low carbon dynamics are actually about.